Hey everyone, Jody here, just letting you know that it is the heart of the summer, which means that the members of the This Day crew are taking some little trips, getting some family time in, some downtime. Hopefully you are as well. Anyway, that means that here is a favorite episode from the vaults, but rest assured, we will be back with brand new episodes real soon. See you then. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 28th, 1975. This incident actually happened on the 29th of December, 1975, but we're doing it today on the 28th. A bomb detonates near the TWA baggage claim terminal at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. The blast killed 11 people and seriously injured 74 others. Investigators later concluded that an equivalent of 25 sticks of dynamite had been placed in a coin-operated locker located next to the baggage carousels. The bomb blew the lockers apart, sending fragments flying across the room. It was that fragmentation that caused all 11 deaths. So let's talk about the LaGuardia bombing of 1975, a story that I gotta say I had no idea about, and I feel like I'm pretty tuned into the history of New York City, not to mention the fact that this story is really interesting because we kind of still don't for sure know who was behind this bombing. So here to discuss is Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley on holiday break the day that we're taping this, so it's just the two of us. This is a very heavy story. It is our second to last one of the year, and listeners, I promise we will end the year on a much sillier note for next episode. But let's talk about this bombing in 1975. And Niki, usually on our show, I like to start in very specific. We like to dive right into the specifics of the story and then pull back. But in this case, I do wonder if we can start with a broader context on two fronts, which is one, 1975 is a really interesting year in American history, and then also the level of violence and in particular bombings that Americans in this era encountered and just kind of had to live with in the ether. I don't think we can emphasize enough how much these were in the consciousness. So the 1975 of it all, I suppose if that year sticks out in anyone's mind, they probably think that was the year that the Vietnam War finally formally came to a close. I mean, what else about that year helps us understand this moment?
I feel like we talk about this every time we talk about the 1970s because it is this decade where there was a real sense of fragmentation and just the country coming apart at the seams. Obviously, not just the end of the Vietnam War, but the North Vietnamese victory in the war in Vietnam, the forces that the U.S. had been fighting against. So that was kind of the moment when it became clear that the U.S., which had withdrawn a few years earlier, has lost this war. But it's also, it's a year after Watergate, so Ford is pardoning Nixon. It's a year before the 200th anniversary of the United States. So there's like this build up to the bicentennial that's going on at the time. Gas prices are really high. There's a crisis. There are all these crises that are going on in the 1970s. And one of those crises is just a lot of political violence. We've talked about groups like the Weather Underground, so these kind of domestic groups, but there were actually groups from all over the world who had turned to the United States as a place to make a statement about geopolitics. Like if the U.S. is going to be a leader in politics and media, it's going to be New York in particular is the home of the United Nations. It's a place where immigrants from around the world come. That is going to be the place where we make our political causes known, and the way we're going to make them known is through bombings. And bombings in New York between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s, we're talking about thousands of bombings. I think there was a year where there were more than 300 bombings in the city, because this is just it's like a calling card. It's like a protest. They're usually not deadly. There usually aren't big penalties for doing this. And it just is kind of part of life in New York for about 20 years.
There's an 18-month stretch between 69 and 70 where there are 370 bombings in New York City.
Wild.
It's wild. And, to your point, I don't know if this really matters, but largely those are, a lot of those are accidents. A lot of those are kind of symbolic. They're set off. I'm not trying to give anyone credit here, but they're set off in ways where it's like people aren't going to get hurt, but they're more to make a statement. We will get into that and how that plays into here. But, another thought on the sort of 1975-ness of this all. This is a really interesting moment. First of all, we should point out Gerald Ford, there's 2 assassination attempts on him in 1975. Like, talk about another kind of little data point on how rocky of a year that is. That said, I do think of 76 as, especially around the bicentennial, as this moment where maybe the country is kind of shaking something or kind of rethinking about, American pride or whatever. And, I guess there's a story of 75 where you could write where it's like, finally the war is over. Finally, like, Watergate is settled, maybe in this unsatisfying way, but it's, Nixon's gone and pardoned and sort of that's off to the side. Like, maybe there's a little bit of a turn. And it's just an interesting reminder of how quickly the sort of tides of history change over the course of just months, because obviously you could say, okay, maybe we proclaim that 76 was this interesting, patriotic, hopeful year, but then by 78 we're back in the malaise or whatever. And so, it is just this really interesting, twisty, turning moment, pocked with all of this kind of violence. Now, one thing you said about New York and the United States becoming this kind of meddling ground for all these other conflicts around the world. I mean, I suppose part of that is like, well, if the U.S. is going to sort of get its fingers into all sorts of little conflicts around the world, then those conflicts can come to the United States as well. And so you get all these like interscene conflicts all of a sudden playing out on the streets of New York.
Yeah, I mean, the two or three big ones are anti-Castro Cuban forces who are in New York, who are attacking both Cuban and Soviet outposts throughout the city, throughout the tri-state area. You have the Jewish Defense League, which we should definitely talk about sometime, that is very active in New York during this period. And then you have something that seems to have very little to do with the United States, which is the Croatian nationalist movement. It is sort of... It's hard to say why it's targeting the U.S. in some ways, other than these like broader atmospheric issues of calling attention to their cause, because the U.S. doesn't have much in the way of domestic policy dealings within Yugoslavia. But basically, there are Croatian nationalist groups that are bombing several sites across New York over the course of several years, including the Statue of Liberty. And they're doing so to call attention to their nationalist cause. They would like the U.S. to halt foreign aid to the region until Croatian national independence is recognized. But really, it's about making sure people around the world know that this fight is happening and what the stakes are.
And, that New York is just home to all sorts of expats. And, we talked about this a little bit when we did the episode about the IRA and, how Ireland's conflicts were often played out in the United States, both in terms of funding, but actually on the streets as well. And you just have kind of all the different factions that are represented in a country that is going through conflict are also represented in the immigrant community in New York. And so they're kind of fighting it out with each other, in addition to, as you said, trying to send a bigger message.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really important part of this, because some of those, I mean, to just stick with the Croatians for reasons that will become clear in a minute, it was bombings of Serbian businesses or Serbian immigrants, because it was a kind of, if the opposite of bringing the war home, like bringing the war to where you were. And these kind of widening conflicts that were playing out, especially for ethnic nationalist movements, right? It's not necessarily contained by borders, because the person from the different background or nationality is your enemy. So it doesn't matter that you're not in Yugoslavia at the time. It matters that that person represents the nationalist movement that you're fighting against.
All right, let's go to the 29th of December to LaGuardia Airport. I sort of made a passing reference, and we've done this in a couple other episodes, to the fact that like sometimes these bombs are planted in a way where it's to send a message and not harm people. I mean, we did that episode about the bombing at the U.S. Capitol, and that was like set in a sort of empty hallway underneath a bench, and it like damaged a painting, and I think was very clearly like about sending a message, not about hurting people. To me, planting a bomb at a baggage terminal at an airport in the height of the holiday season doesn't initially jump out to me as we're trying to avoid innocent deaths.
Not at all. And that's why this is an exceptional case worth talking about. You have all of these hijackings and bombings in the 1970s where no one is really hurt. Or sometimes if somebody is hurt or killed, it's almost by accident. But in this case, I mean, this bomb explodes in the baggage claim area a little after 6:30 in the evening. That is not 2 a.m., right? Like that is a time when there are tons and tons of people there. And it's not a small amount of dynamite. This is a massive explosion. And as you talked about in the introduction, it turns all of this metal shrapnel into a weapon that just like goes into a crowd. And actually, 11 people die. This is the deadliest terror attack in New York City until 9/11, at least since, the 1920 bombing at Wall Street, which was much deadlier. But in some ways, folks got off easy because just maybe 30 minutes before, 2 flights had come in and that place had been packed with people. And if that bomb had gone off a half hour earlier, that death toll would have been much, much higher.
As the investigation proceeds, there is I think, credible conclusion that the bomb had been intended to maybe go off 12 hours earlier or 12 hours later, 6:30 in the morning, not 6:30 in the afternoon. I don't know much about bomb technology, but it was like pretty rudimentary clock that was attached to this thing. And so I think the idea that it was set wrong or just sort of went off at the wrong time is plausible. But perhaps that is an indication that this was intended to be largely in the vein of those others, of being kind of symbolic, going off at a time when there wouldn't be a lot of people around. But of course, you're taking a risk when you plant a bomb in the middle of an airport.
You are, and you're still very much responsible for it. But I do think that it signals that there's something very different about this era of terrorism than the era of terrorism the going into the 90s and 2000s, when the goal is to kill as many people as possible and to take credit for that catastrophic loss of life. And it's just it's a different moment. We call it all terrorism, but it looks very different in the 1970s.
Well, and on that credit front, I mean, that's part of the story here, is no one really seems to take credit. And maybe that's another indication that, oh gosh, this didn't go down how we intended it to. But it's kind of surprising, right? If you pull off something like this, usually you get someone taking credit.
Yeah, and you have so many potential suspects because, again, people were bombing stuff all the time. It could have been Puerto Rican militants. It could have been the PLO. It could have been the Jewish Defense League. It could have been the mafia was using bombings all the time in New York City. Right. And then it could have been these Croatian groups who had been very active in New York City at the time. But that idea that part of the problem with finding out who did this is A, nobody takes credit, but B, everyone's bombing stuff. So it's hard to figure out who's doing it. And
that's part of these kinds of moments too, is often people take false credit, right? They jump in and you get a few different people saying, this was us. But none of that really happens here. Nevertheless, no surprise, a huge investigation proceeds. 120 NYPD detectives, 600 FBI agents, the ATF is involved, the Port Authority is involved. They find, again, that it was either TNT or plastic explosive controlled by a kind of rudimentary household alarm clock that had a 6-volt battery attached to it. How do then they eventually hone in on this group or this conflict that you've mentioned a number of times, these Croatians?
So part of the reason was because of a lot of ongoing investigations into other bombings. The bombing seemed similar to a plane hijacking that had taken place not long before. There had been a bombing of the same airport the year after by a Croatian terror group. There were potential confessions, although they were all done under non-constitutional procedure. And so, So a year later, when there is a hijacking, one of the people involved there, who is a part of this Croatian nationalist fight, does confess and then quickly walks it back and says, I gave this under duress, under sleep deprivation. And so it's unclear. But, it's a hint. It's an indication. Right. And so they had kind of focused in on various Croatian nationalists, including one who I think had been at the airport. His flight had come in an hour before the bombing, and they're like, well, they could have done it. But they never figure it out. And in part, they never figure it out because in the rush to save lives after the bombing and to get people out, the first responders come in and they spray everything down with water, and they try to save lives over preserving evidence. And so there's just not enough evidence to connect all the dots. Yeah. Largely speaking, those dots haven't been conclusively
connected. I mean, and as of last year, the crime remains officially unsolved. There's also this other theory that the FBI didn't really want to investigate too closely because it would potentially expose informants. And so I think people are getting the picture of kind of how convoluted a web there is of suspects and incentives and so forth around an incident like this.
Yeah. And law enforcement does eventually, it breaks up some of these Croatian groups active in the United States. So this is really one of the last moments in the mid-1970s that this particular group is going to be involved in these bombings. So, there's an effective response. But I also think that there's this case particularly sticks in everyone's craw because it is one that was so deadly. And while they had been able to solve many other bombings, in most cases in these bombings in the 60s and 70s, people don't even go to jail for them because there isn't a loss of life. And this is one where they were like, look, people died and we want to hold someone accountable. Yeah.
We don't have to go down this rabbit hole too much, but, I should say, this story brings up a lot for me in that, my dad was involved in a bombing in Nicaragua as a journalist in 1984. And so many of the kind of parallels here, that was something that was tied up in the Civil War in Nicaragua with U.S. meddling, all of these very convoluted battles, the same sort of thing of foreign entanglements, shady figures, multiple people taking credit. And, my parents devoted much of the rest of their careers to trying to untangle all of this and, I think reached some conclusions. There's a book you can read about the Lipinka bombing if you want. But I bring it up only to point out that all of this is just so resonant to kind of that experience of it's not like you just find a thread and you pull on it and then you reach whoever's standing at the end of it. I mean, it is so convoluted in these moments.
And what I think is so important about your parents' story is one of the things that they did was they really tried to hold the U.S. government accountable for creating the conditions that led to that bombing. And that kind of broader view of those foreign entanglements that you're talking about, that the U.S. is not hands clean in these things, even if it's not a member of the government setting the bomb. It's an important, again, dot connecting to do when figuring out who's ultimately responsible.
Well, we will leave it there, and maybe we'll do an episode about the Lipinka bombing with my folks at some point.
That would be amazing.
But there's plenty of reporting out there that people can find. But that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.